Even if we have some equipment and blah, 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 after a while you dive because of the cold, which is not a bad way to dive because you fall in sleep and it's not, you don't suffer in this case. We know that, but we never think that could happen, it never come to our head.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I had a conversation with PH just as recently as a few months ago. I kept giving him shit for going out there. I said, PH, by you being out there, you legitimize what this guy's doing. It's a tacit endorsement. And worse than that, I think he's using your involvement with the project and your presence on the site as a way to fucking lure people into it. Who said this? And what was PH's response? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Thank you to the thousands who have subscribed. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So if we are to understand PH Nargeolet's death, we need to know a little about his life, including his life before Titan, as well as the blue carpet ride that led him to becoming Stockton Rush's Employee of the Month. The statement cited a few moments ago is from someone who knew and worked with PH Nargeolet, Patrick Leahy, the CEO of Stockton Rush's biggest rival, Triton Submarines. Once upon a time, PH Nargeolet worked for a different crew with a different CEO. Instead of Stockton Rush, there was Victor Vescovo, a Texan hedge fund manager. Instead of Lockridge, John Ramsey was key to the success of an innovative submersible called the Limiting Factor. And so this is PH Nargeolet in a former life with a different submersible crew. The mission: dive down to the deepest point of all 5 oceans. Different standards, different vibe. So how did PH Nargeolet end up on board the 5 Deeps project? According to an article in the New Yorker, quote, "When I set out on the 5 Deeps project, I told Patrick Leahy, look, I don't know submarine technology. I need someone who works for me to independently validate." Those words need to be highlighted. I need someone to independently validate whatever design you come up with and its construction and operation. And those are the words of Vescovo, basically Stockton Rush's counterpart. And so Leahy recommended PH Nargeolet, who he'd known for many, many years, decades in fact. And Nargeolet at that point was kind of an interesting character. His wife had recently died. He was a former French naval commander. He knew about underwater explosives. He spent a lot of his life at sea. And he basically had, as far as Vescovo was concerned, the perfect resume. He had a really good reputation. And he liked the fact that he was French. I think it's important to point out at this point that Nargeolet isn't an engineer. He's a very experienced pilot in terms of submersibles, and in later years, a storyteller. In terms of the former, Nargeolet was already visiting the Titanic in 1987, barely 2 years before it was first discovered. In terms of the latter, Nargeolet was involved in numerous documentary films and also wrote books, including In the Depths of the Titanic, which was published in 2022. And that was during his association with OceanGate. OceanGate also used Nargeolet to promote their own coffee table book in November of the same year, when issues with their prototype put the company through 3 years of limbo. It's not clear when exactly Nargeolet joined OceanGate, but we do know the 5 Deeps project ended in 2019, and by mid-2021, Nargeolet was already featuring in OceanGate's social media, despite protests from his former Triton crewmates. According to the New Yorker, quote, "Nargeolet remained obsessed with the Titanic, and before long he was invited to return. To PH, the Titanic was Ulysses' sirens. He could not resist it," Vescovo told the journalist who wrote the New Yorker article, Ben Taub. We also know that when Nargeolet climbed into the Titan, it was a very different submersible compared to everything he'd been in before. But I suppose submersibles are all prototypes. They're all very different from one another. But it was owned by a company that had already spent years marketing to the general public that for a fee of $250,000, that's according to this article, it would bring people to the most famous shipwreck on Earth, end quote. Now, what is clearly a red flag, certainly in retrospect, is looking at how OceanGate was actively marketing their tourist trips to the Titanic long before Titan's first successful dive. Do you know when that was? They were selling tickets long before, in some cases advertising Titan as long as 4 years before they'd actually gone down to Titanic safely themselves. And if you go through their social media, you'll see that on April 19th, 2019, it's about 4 years ago now, the OceanGate set a world record with their first manned dive down to 3,760 meters, but that was in the Bahamas. Their first successful dive, which actually included Nargeolet, only occurred in 2021, July 11, 2021. So it took 2 years from that first dive at that particular depth to dive to the Titanic. And then we had the tragedy 2 years after that. Now, you would imagine that PH's former colleagues, guys like John Ramsey, who was the designer of the limiting factor submersible that were used during the 5 Deeps expedition, you would imagine that they would have explained to him, communicated to him, the difference between metal exposed to pressure compared to carbon fiber, at least at some point. And so what John Ramsey said, and this is also quoting from the New Yorker, quote, "The metal gradually strengthens under repeated exposure to incredible stresses," right? So every subsequent time a metal submersible goes down, it actually strengthens, it consolidates. With carbon fiber, the pressure testing slowly breaks the hull fiber by tiny fiber. And so according to John Ramsey, if you're repeatedly nearing that threshold of the material, then there's just no way of knowing how many cycles it will survive, end quote. And so what he's really talking about is, yes, you can go down to the Titanic once in a particular vehicle, but every successive time you're nearing that point where of destructibility, of ultimate destructibility, because you're wearing it down. And so Leigh's business partner, the co-founder of Triton Submarines, wrote to his team on March 1st, 2018, I think his name is McCullum. He said, and this is obviously predicting what ultimately happened, he said, "It doesn't get more sensational than dead people in a sub on the way to Titanic. And isn't that exactly what happened?" And so McCullum tried to reason with Rush directly. He said, you are wanting to use a prototype unclassed technology in a very hostile place. As much as I appreciate entrepreneurship and innovation, you're potentially putting an entire industry at risk. And this was 2018. One does also wonder, did Rush ever confide in Nargeolet? Did Nargeolet and Rush ever have private conversations regarding this whole thing? Or were they both sort of on board as being dismissive of it? Because when you see Nargeolet talk, he seems to be quite dismissive of danger. You heard that at the beginning of Stockton Rush, he seems to sort of take that charismatic position where he can take everything in his stride, where of course there's a risk, of course there's a danger, and one's kind of got to have a sense of humor about it. Now, apparently Rush replied to this email a few days later, saying that he'd grown tired of industry players, essentially competitors, trying to use a safety argument to stop innovation and to prevent new entrants from entering their small existing market. You kind of get the sense that he resents it as a way of keeping him out of competition, right? And then he says, well, that is the nature of innovation. And he went on to say, we've heard the basis cries of you're going to kill someone way too often. In other words, it's kind of something that has been repeated over and over again, and now he's just starting to block it out. is been warned and criticized so many times that he's now just literally turning that messaging off. Is kind of blocking the sender. And as I say, he said, we take this as a serious personal insult. Stop criticizing what we're doing. We know what we're doing. Stop insulting us. And one can imagine Nargeolet in his mid-70s would have known to be careful not to criticize the charismatic but sometimes prickly Stockton Rush. I'm not sure how well Nargeolet's finances were, and I think that's a very important thing to look into. But he likely had a military pension, and he was a widower, so perhaps maybe he needed a job. I also think the presence of Hamish Harding, who'd dived with Vescovo and the limiting factor, I think he may have been a factor in everyone's calculus. I mean, in the calculus of the male ego. Sure, there was risk, but this was a coming together of three different egos. And I'm sure there was a sense of, I'm not going to be the one who blinks first. In a sense, I think there was one man playing off the confidence of another. And yeah, you have three men with really well-established, recognized reputations in Nargeolet, in Stockton Rush, and in Hamish Harding. And so, can you see it? There's a sense of one man playing off the confidence of another, rather than really each man assaging the risks independently and thinking for themselves. If it had been me, if I had been in the situation, it's hard to say, but I would imagine if I'd simply heard that the sub and platform were being tossed around pretty roughly on a daily basis, and that is what the Travel Weekly editor Arnie Wiseman said to Hamish Harding. If I'd heard that, I think that would have put me off. Just that on its own would have put me off. And maybe I would have said, is this normal? Is it normal for this boat to be bobbing around like that? Is that what happened last year? And they would have said, no, it was on a ship. And I think that would have, the red lights would have gone up for me. But what if I'd already paid $250,000? What if I'd already paid for flights and accommodation in America and St. John's? What if I'd already told people that I was doing something? And perhaps Hamish Harding thought, well, you know what, I've been down to the deepest part of the ocean. I've already been down to the Mariana Trench and I survived that. This is half as deep. And one of the crew affiliated with that diving company is also part of this one. So what could go wrong? Perhaps he reasoned a craft designed to withstand crushing depths won't be affected by being tossed around in waves. That already is faulty reasoning. In fact, Stockton Rush himself has said, you can't drill anything into carbon fiber. Metal, yes. Carbon fiber, absolutely not. So it can't actually withstand mechanical damage as strong, as tough as that hull actually is. It's like the rim of a bicycle. A carbon rim of a bicycle can't really withstand lateral damage like hitting a sidewalk or going over big stones in terms of the sidewall. Anyway, now that we have additional context in place, let's replay that statement from the Triton CEO, Patrick Leahy. For the Five Deeps crew, Nargeolet's legacy is complicated by the circumstances of his final dives. Now that's quoting from the New Yorker. Now this is what Leahy says. I had a conversation with PH just as recently as a few months ago. He told me I kept giving him shit for going out there. And I think what he means by that is going out there with OceanGate. He said, PH, by you being out there, in brackets with OceanGate, you legitimize what this guy is doing. Which guy? Stockton Rush. It's a tacit endorsement. Tacit endorsement of what? Of this defective submersible. And worse than that, I think he's using your involvement with the project, meaning I think Stockton is using you, PH Nargeolet, your involvement with the Titan and these trips to the Titanic, and your presence on the site as a way to fucking lure people into it. And doesn't that sound like that does actually make sense? And so the question is, how did Nargeolet reply to this? If it does make sense, if it is true, if there is an element of truth in it, what did Nargeolet think about it when he was confronted with it? And his response was, I'm getting old. That's his response. I'm getting old. I'm a grieving widower. And you know what? If you've got to go, that would be a good way to go instantly. So he seems to be saying, I'm too tired to fight about this. And if that's the way it's going to end, so be it. In other words, he's resigned himself to some extent. There's resignation in that comment. But you can't say PH didn't know, and worse, that he didn't know that he was being used to tacitly endorse a dodgy vessel. You can't say he wasn't aware of that. Maybe he was even flattered by that. So you do intuit a kind of resignation. An old man used to false alarms, used to delayed dives, used to going back to the drawing board. Someone who has limited agency, right? As much as he's got all of this experience, he's not the one running the show. It's always someone else running the show. And his expertise is really limited to storytelling and presentation and prestige. He's kind of a trophy. And so he sees his role, his influence, his power as quite limited. But that's likely not how others saw Mr. Titanic. That's the important part. I don't know if he thought about that part. Also, if he was the star of the show, did he really want to be the one who brought the curtain down on it all prematurely? So what I see is a kind of weary fatalism going on with Nargeolet. I mean, yes, he's an expert, but he's an expert tour guide to a subterranean graveyard. In a way, he was the world's foremost guide on the world's largest ocean graveyard. And let's not forget his wife, Michelle Marsh, a broadcast journalist, had left him not just a widower, but a grieving widower. He was missing her. His life wasn't the same without her. She seemed to be an exceptional woman, beautiful as well. The last thing I want to say, I've said a little bit more on Patreon than I'm going to say here, but the last thing I want to say is that when Arnie Wiseman asked PH why he kept returning to the wreck, 37 visits, he died on the 38th, he answered, each time is totally different. You always see things you've never seen before. Well, on his 38th dive, PH did see something he'd never seen before. He'd not seen it coming, even though, like Stockton, he'd been warned and likely also felt insulted perhaps by those warnings. Pride comes, as they say, before the fall. In PH's case, sometimes it's important to speak up, even if it's not really your business to. When he was asked what good is it being down there in a defective sub, he said he might be able to steer them out of danger. But another way to do that was on the surface, before getting in. And so my question is this. Wasn't PH Nargeolet, besides Stockton Rush, wasn't he in the best position to decide to scrub Mission 5? Others like David Pogue and Arnie Wiseman saw the signs. Why didn't he? And I think the answer is that cyclical failures are subtle, and the very nature of them is that you are able to do one more dive. And again, you can do maybe one more dive and some more fibers break, but you can do one more dive again and again until the moment that you can't do one more dive. And so in that situation, who is strong enough, confident enough to stand up and say to a trio of dreamers, guys, I think we've reached the threshold. And this is how the nightmare of interrupting those dreams leads to a far bigger nightmare. And I think that is one thing we need to realize as human beings. Sometimes we are faced with a nightmare, but dealing with that nightmare prevents us, it allows us to avoid the far worse, the far bigger nightmare. So I want you to think about this in the face of a situation you might be in where you are asked to make an uncomfortable and unpleasant, a difficult decision. Are you responsible for a nightmare, but But at the same time, is this responsibility you have potentially going to prevent an even bigger nightmare? If that's the case, well, then it's worth it, isn't it? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.